They will take the more difficult route that will jeopardize the standing of the British royal family if they have.
One moment she was standing on the most famous balcony in the world, and the next she was being escorted away before a crowd, and the king himself could not hide his shock. What did Parliament discover that was serious enough to strip Camilla of her power, and why did it all happen in front of the entire watching world? Join us as we uncover the truth. Post-Elizabethan instability. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II had been the one constant in British life, a steady, familiar presence who had guided the monarchy through scandals, wars, social change, and crisis after crisis. Always with the same quiet composure that made people feel, no matter how uncertain the world became, that something at the center of it all was holding firm. Then, on September 8, 2022, she was gone, and nothing inside the palace walls would ever be quite the same again. The grief that swept across Britain and much of the world was genuine and deep, but grief eventually passed, and what it left behind in this case was something far more complicated. A monarchy in transition, stepping into a new era without the one person who had defined it for longer than most people had been alive. King Charles III took the throne as a man already in his 70s, carrying decades of public scrutiny, personal controversy, and complicated history on his shoulders. And while many people were willing to give him a fair chance, the pressure surrounding him from the very first days of his reign was immense and unrelenting. The public wanted unity. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe that the institution their late queen had devoted her entire life to protecting was in safe and capable hands. And Charles worked visibly hard to project exactly that, appearing at engagements, delivering careful speeches, and moving through the early rituals of kingship with evident determination. But those closest to the palace could see something that the carefully managed public appearances did not fully reveal. Behind the ceremony and the tradition, the king was carrying a weight that went beyond grief, and the stability everyone was hoping for was already, quietly, beginning to show its first cracks. Something was shifting inside those walls, and not everyone was shifting in the same direction. Shifting power dynamics within the palace. In the months that followed the Queen's death, the palace began to settle into a new rhythm, a new order of faces, voices, and influences that would gradually reshape how decisions were made, how information flowed, and who truly held sway over the man now sitting on the throne. On the surface, everything looked appropriate and orderly. Camilla had been queen consort since the coronation, a title that carried enormous symbolic weight and came with its own set of responsibilities, appearances, and expectations. And she performed those public duties with a confidence that surprised many people who had spent years viewing her with suspicion or outright hostility. But something beyond the public role was developing quietly and steadily behind the scenes, something that the cameras at official engagements and the carefully worded press releases did not capture. A gradual expansion of Camilla's presence within the internal workings of the palace that went well beyond what her ceremonial position was designed to cover. Those who worked within the institution began to notice the change in small ways at first, a shift in who was present at certain meetings, a change in whose opinions seemed to carry the most weight when the king was making decisions, a sense that the informal channels of influence, the ones that never appear in any official record, were being quietly redirected. At the same time, something else was happening in parallel. The visible influence of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, appeared to be contracting rather than growing, which struck many observers as deeply unusual given that William was the heir to the throne and would one day be responsible for carrying the entire institution forward. Catherine in particular seemed to be stepping back from the kind of prominent, high-visibility role that many had expected her to occupy during this period. With engagements becoming less frequent and her presence at key moments less central than it had been in previous years, and while some of this was attributed to personal and health-related factors, those paying close attention felt that the full explanation was more complicated. The tension between Catherine and Camilla had never been a secret. It had simmered for years beneath the polished surface of royal appearances, expressed in small signals and careful silences, rather than open confrontation. But now that tension had a new context, a new power structure surrounding it, and a new set of stakes that made it far more significant than palace gossip. Something was tilting inside the institution, and the people who understood how royal power actually worked were beginning to ask questions that nobody in an official position was prepared to answer. Early warning indicators. The first signs that something was genuinely wrong inside the palace did not arrive as dramatic revelations or public scandals. They arrived quietly, in the form of patterns, small shifts that on their own might have meant very little, but when placed side by side, began to tell a story that was difficult to dismiss. Long-serving members of the royal household, people who had dedicated years or even decades of their professional lives to the institution, began to quietly disappear from their posts, some announcing retirements, others departing with little explanation, and their replacements were not always the kind of experienced, independently minded professionals that royal households had traditionally sought out and valued. Instead, the new arrivals tended to share certain characteristics. They were loyal to specific interests within the palace, rather than to the institution as a whole. They were less likely to push back or offer counsel that challenged the prevailing mood, and their appointments seemed to follow a logic that had more to do with alignment than with qualification or experience. For those watching closely, this was not just an administrative reshuffling. It was a fundamental change in the character of the advisory structure surrounding the king, a structure that in any healthy institution exists precisely to ensure that the person at the top receives honest, balanced, and independent guidance, rather than a carefully filtered version of reality shaped by whoever controls the flow of information. The communication channels reaching King Charles began to show signs of that filtering, with reports from multiple sources suggesting that certain perspectives were being amplified, while others were being softened, delayed, or simply never arriving at all. And a king who was already navigating an enormously demanding transition was doing so increasingly without the full picture in front of him. Catherine's situation during this period added another layer of concern to what was already an unsettling picture. Her public profile, which had been growing steadily and positively for years, began to contract in ways that felt deliberate rather than circumstantial, with engagements canceled, international visits reduced, and projects she had invested significant personal energy into seeming to stall without clear explanation. The cumulative effect of all these shifts, the personnel changes, the communication distortions, and Catherine's diminishing visibility, was to create an internal environment that felt increasingly unbalanced, and the imbalance was no longer something that could be explained away as coincidence or the natural turbulence of institutional change. The Camilla files. Everything changed when a classified dossier arrived in Prince William's possession, a document that those who prepared it had clearly spent considerable time and effort compiling, drawing together threads of information from multiple sources inside the palace into a single, structured, and deeply troubling picture of what had been happening behind the scenes during the months since his grandmother's death. The dossier became known informally as the Camilla files, and its contents were not the product of rumor, speculation, or the kind of unverifiable whisper that circulates in any large institution. They were based on records, on documented communications, on meeting logs and personnel files, and internal correspondence that together told a story far more serious than anything that had previously been suggested in public. At the center of that story was a systematic and deliberate effort to reshape the advisory and operational structure of the palace in ways that concentrated influence in one place and in the hands of one person, with loyalists placed into key positions across multiple departments, creating a network of aligned individuals who could shape the flow of information, manage access to the king, and ensure that decisions moved in directions that served a specific set of interests, rather than the institution as a whole. The meeting records contained within the dossier were particularly significant, documenting gatherings that had taken place without the knowledge or involvement of individuals who by any reasonable standard should have been present, meetings where consequential decisions about palace operations, personnel, and communication strategy had been discussed and effectively determined before they ever reached the people whose authority they affected. The internal communications told a similar story, revealing a pattern of coordination between individuals who occupied formally separate roles, but were operating in practice as a connected network, sharing information selectively, reinforcing particular narratives, and working to ensure that alternative perspectives did not gain traction with the one person whose opinion ultimately mattered most. Personnel restructuring data completed the picture, showing clearly that the pattern of appointments and departures that had seemed puzzling when viewed in isolation was anything but random when mapped across a timeline, each change fitting into a broader architecture of influence that had been built quietly, piece by piece, over a sustained period of time. William read through the evidence carefully and thoroughly, and when he reached the end of it, he understood that what he was holding in his hands was not a family problem requiring a private conversation. It was something far larger, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous to the institution he was one day destined to lead. Operational manipulation exposed. The dossier did not simply describe a general shift in palace dynamics. It laid out in precise and documented detail exactly how that shift had been engineered at an operational level, moving beyond broad patterns of influence and into the specific mechanisms through which Catherine's work had been undermined. Media narratives had been redirected, and Camilla's reach had been extended into areas of palace life that her formal role was never designed to touch. Catherine's projects were among the clearest examples of deliberate interference documented within the files. Initiatives she had invested significant personal energy and public credibility into were shown to have been delayed through administrative obstruction, stripped of internal support that had previously been committed, or quietly reassigned in ways that reduced their visibility and impact without any official explanation being offered to Catherine herself or to the public who had been following her work. The effect of these interventions was not accidental. Each one served to shrink Catherine's presence within the institution at precisely the moment when her role as the future queen should have been growing, and the timing and consistency of the pattern made it impossible to attribute to coincidence or the normal friction of institutional bureaucracy. Media management told a parallel story, with evidence in the dossier suggesting that the flow of information to royal correspondents and press offices had been subtly but consistently shaped to favor certain narratives over others. Stories that reflected positively on Camilla's expanding role were amplified and facilitated, while coverage that might have elevated Catherine or highlighted her contributions was discouraged, redirected, or simply starved of the access and cooperation it needed to develop. Key royal events had also been subject to quiet reassignment, with occasions that would naturally and appropriately have involved Catherine finding themselves instead handled through Camilla's office, not through any formal decision or announced change in protocol, but through a series of small administrative choices that collectively redirected public attention and institutional prestige in a very deliberate direction. The expansion of Camilla's informal influence had also extended into the political sphere in ways that raised serious concerns, with records showing private receptions involving significant political figures being arranged and hosted in ways that positioned her as a central access point for those wishing to engage with the palace, effectively placing her between the king and the outside world in a role that carried real consequence. Controlling access to the king was perhaps the most consequential element of all, because an institution runs on information and a monarch governs on counsel. And if both of those things are being filtered through a single point of interest, then the decisions emerging from that institution are no longer fully the king's own. They are the product of whatever picture of reality he has been allowed to see. What William was now looking at was not simply inappropriate behavior or an overreach of personal ambition. It was a functioning parallel authority structure, operating inside the most scrutinized institution in the world, and it had been hiding in plain sight. Constitutional risk identified. There was a moment, somewhere in the process of working through the evidence laid out in the dossier, when William made a significant mental shift, one that would determine everything about how he chose to respond to what he had discovered and what the consequences of that response would ultimately be. Up until that point, it would have been entirely possible, and in many ways far more comfortable, to frame what was happening as a family matter, a difficult and painful dynamic between people who shared a complicated history, the kind of tension that exists in many families and is best resolved through private conversation, careful diplomacy, and time, kept well away from institutions and formal processes, and anything that might cause lasting damage to relationships that could not easily be repaired. But the evidence in the dossier made that framing impossible to sustain honestly, because what it described was not the friction of family dynamics playing out in an unusual setting. It was a deliberate and sustained interference with the functioning of a constitutional institution, and those two things required completely different responses. The heir to the throne occupying a diminished and obstructed role was not a personal inconvenience. It was a structural problem, with direct implications for how power was distributed within the monarchy and how that power would be transferred when the time came. And an institution whose lines of authority had been blurred or deliberately confused was an institution that could not function with the transparency and integrity that its survival depended upon. The unwritten constitutional norms that govern the British monarchy are not laws in the conventional sense. They cannot be enforced through courts in the way that legislation can, but they are nonetheless the framework within which the entire institution operates. And they exist precisely because the monarchy's authority rests not on force or formal legal power, but on public trust, on the belief that the people within it are behaving with integrity and in accordance with roles that are clearly understood and properly respected. What the dossier described was a breach of those norms at a fundamental level, and William understood clearly that a breach of that kind, if left unaddressed, did not simply create a problem in the present moment. It set a precedent. It established that the boundaries could be moved without consequence, and in an institution built entirely on the authority of precedent and tradition, that was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to allow to stand. He understood something else too, something that was perhaps harder to sit with than the constitutional analysis, that choosing to do nothing in the face of clear evidence was not a neutral act. It was a choice with its own consequences, and those consequences would eventually fall on the institution he was bound by birth, duty, and genuine conviction to protect. Inaction, he concluded, was not caution, it was complicity, and complicity was not something he was prepared to accept. Historical confirmation, the Queen's letter. At some point during William's careful and methodical process of working through the evidence and thinking through his response, something emerged that he had not anticipated. Something that shifted the entire situation in a way that went beyond the legal and constitutional dimensions and struck at something far more personal and far more profound. A private letter written by Queen Elizabeth II came to light. A document that had not been intended for public knowledge or institutional circulation, but which spoke directly and with unmistakable clarity to the very situation William now found himself navigating. As though his grandmother had in some sense anticipated that this moment might come and had chosen to leave something behind that would speak to it when it did. The letter was not a dramatic document in its tone or its language. It carried the same measured, careful quality that had characterized everything the late Queen communicated throughout her long reign. But its content was precise, and its implications were impossible to misread. Addressing with quiet directness the question of where the boundaries of influence within the monarchy must be maintained, and why the blurring of those boundaries represented a threat that went far beyond any individual personality or any particular moment in time. She had written about the importance of clarity in the lines of authority that run through the institution, about the danger of allowing informal influence to accumulate in ways that distort the formal structure without ever being visible enough to be formally challenged, and about her own observation over decades of rule, that the most serious threats to the monarchy had rarely come from outside it, but from the gradual erosion of the principles that held it together from within. For William, reading those words in the context of everything the dossier had already shown him was an experience that carried enormous weight, because it meant that the concerns he had been working through were not simply his own interpretation of ambiguous evidence. They were concerns that the person who had understood the monarchy more deeply and more completely than anyone alive had also held and had considered serious enough to commit to paper. The letter did something else as well. It removed the last traces of doubt that William might have used to justify stepping back from what the evidence was asking him to do. Because doubt requires the possibility that one's concerns are mistaken or exaggerated, and the Queen's letter closed that possibility with a quiet but absolute finality. What had felt, even with the dossier in hand, like a choice between action and restraint, now felt like something different entirely. It felt like a duty, one that had been passed down to him not just by the institution and the Constitution, but by the woman who had devoted her entire life to both, and whose final private words on the subject left no room for uncertainty about what that duty required. Strategic consolidation and planning. William did not react impulsively to what he had discovered, and that restraint was itself a form of strength, because the evidence in front of him was serious enough that a less disciplined person might have moved immediately, driven by anger into an action that was visible before it was ready, and therefore far easier to dismiss. Instead, he went back through the dossier carefully and methodically, mapping the networks it described, tracing the timelines of appointments and interventions, and identifying the precise points at which influence had been applied and the moments at which it had produced its intended effect, building a complete and coherent picture of what had been constructed inside the palace and how every part of it connected. He defined his objective with equal care, making sure it remained focused on institutional duty rather than personal feeling, because a response driven by emotion would be vulnerable in ways that a response driven by principle simply was not, and that distinction would matter enormously when the time came to act. The goal was clear: remove the interference, restore the integrity of the structures that had been compromised, and do so in a way that reinforced the constitutional principles the monarchy depended upon, principles that existed long before any individual within the institution and would need to survive long after. The balcony appearance was selected as the moment of enforcement with great deliberation, chosen because it combined public visibility with ceremonial weight in a setting too prominent and too widely witnessed to be quietly absorbed or reframed by palace communications afterwards. Everything was now in place, the evidence was organized, the objective was defined, and the stage had been chosen. What remained was to build the legal and institutional foundation that would give the moment its authority, and that meant taking the evidence somewhere far beyond the palace walls. The Westminster intervention. Before the balcony moment could happen, there was a prior and essential step that had to be taken, one that would determine whether what followed carried the weight of legitimate authority or risked being dismissed as a unilateral act driven by personal and dynastic interest. That step was Westminster, and the decision to bring the evidence before a closed parliamentary session was the most consequential single choice William made throughout the entire process, because it transformed what might have been a palace internal matter into something with a formal constitutional dimension that could not be contained or managed away. The session was conducted with the discretion the material demanded, but within that room, the full evidence was laid out: the personnel placements, the communication distortions, the interference with Catherine's work, the political receptions, the gatekeeping of access to the king, all of it presented in the organized and sequenced form William had carefully prepared. The reaction was not uniform, and he had not expected it to be. Those who prioritized stability above all else raised concerns about the consequences of formal intervention, about the signal it would send to the public and to the world, about the internal health of the institution, about whether the cure being proposed might in certain respects be more damaging than the condition it was designed to treat. And their concerns were not trivial or easily dismissed, even by those who found the evidence in the dossier deeply troubling. On the other side of that debate were those who argued that the constitutional question was not one that could be subordinated to concerns about optics or short-term stability, that the limits of a queen consort's authority were not a matter of preference or interpretation, but a foundational principle of how power was supposed to be distributed within a constitutional monarchy, and that allowing a documented breach of those limits to pass without formal consequence was itself a form of institutional damage with its own long-term costs. The debate was serious, substantive, and at moments genuinely tense, but when it reached its conclusion, the outcome was clear. A motion was passed that would strip Camilla of her operational influence within the palace structure, allowing her to retain her title and her ceremonial role, while removing the informal mechanisms through which she had extended her reach well beyond what either of those things were ever intended to cover. The legal framework had spoken, the institutional authority had been engaged, and what came next was the moment the world would actually see. The balcony incident. The public appearance at Buckingham Palace was arranged in the way that all such occasions are arranged, with careful attention to protocol, precise timing, and the kind of polished ceremonial presentation that the monarchy has refined over centuries of practice. And to everyone watching from the street below, and the millions following along at home, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like: a formal royal appearance, dignified and controlled. But behind that surface, everything had already been set in motion. The parliamentary decision had been made, the legal framework had been engaged, and William had positioned everything with the precision of someone who understood that the next few minutes would either succeed completely or fail in full public view, with consequences that could not be taken back. The prearranged signal came, quiet and invisible to the crowd, and what followed happened quickly. Security personnel moved with calm professionalism to Camilla's position on the balcony, and she was escorted away from the public appearance in a manner that left no room for ambiguity about what was happening, even if the watching crowd could not immediately make sense of what they were seeing. The reaction was immediate and disorienting. The crowd below fell into confused murmuring. Cameras caught the disruption without fully understanding it, and King Charles, standing in full view of thousands of people, was visibly and completely stunned. His composure fractured in a way that those who knew him well would have recognized as genuine shock rather than performed emotion. The ceremony had become something else entirely. The careful ritual of monarchy had crossed, in full public view, into the territory of enforcement, and nothing about the image of the British royal family would look quite the same again. What William chose to say next would shape how history remembered this moment: public declaration and aftermath. William did not allow the confusion that followed the balcony incident to fill with speculation and competing narratives. He moved quickly and deliberately to define the moment on his own terms, delivering a public statement that was measured in its language but absolute in its clarity, framing what had happened not as a family rupture or a palace drama, but as a necessary act of institutional protection, carried out in accordance with a formal parliamentary decision. He was careful about the words he used, describing his actions as a restoration of legitimate authority rather than a removal of a person, drawing a clear line between the title Camilla retained and the operational influence she no longer held, and positioning the entire intervention within the constitutional framework that the Westminster session had established, so that it could be understood as the conclusion of a process rather than the beginning of a crisis. The immediate consequences unfolded on several fronts simultaneously. Camilla was removed from the informal power structure that the dossier had documented. The parliamentary motion reinforced the constitutional boundaries that her influence had crossed, and William emerged from the episode with a clarity of authority that he had not previously possessed in such visible and unambiguous form. The personal cost was real and significant. King Charles had been stunned by what happened on the balcony, and the emotional fracture between father and son that followed was not something that institutional language or constitutional justification could easily repair. Because whatever the legal and structural merits of William's actions, Charles had experienced them as a profound and public shock delivered by his own child. William accepted that cost because the alternative, allowing what the dossier described to continue unchallenged, had consequences that extended far beyond any single relationship, however important. and the monarchy had survived for centuries, precisely because the people within it had, at the moments that mattered most, chosen the institution over themselves. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, like this video, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one.